Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. One quick announcement. Solo has its first sponsor. Today's episode of Solo is sponsored by Rapture Masks. That's Rapture with a W, like wrap it up. And since I recommend wearing protection during sex, I also recommend wrapping your face when you go out into the wild. And Rapture has made the best non-medical grade mask money can buy. It's antimicrobial, breathable, and most importantly, fully machine washable, so you aren't one and done. One mask lasts over 50 washes. I've been using it for weeks, and it's my favorite mask. You can find them on Twitter, Instagram, and at rapturemasks.com. That's Rapture, W-R-A-P-T-U-R-E, masks.com. And you can use promo code RaptureSolo, again with a W, at checkout for a discount. Stay safe out there, people. Okay, now on to the episode. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Peter McGraw. That's right. This is the first installment in what I call Solo Thoughts, an episode with no guest. As you may know, I've experimented with something I call Things Pete Thinks within some of the episodes. But besides being a terrible name, it just takes too much time. So this is a bit of an experiment. COVID's still a thing, and so what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about health. And in part 2, I'm going to talk a little bit about well-being. And as you won't be surprised to hear, I think that both are important to living a remarkable life. If I continue to do solo thoughts, I will dedicate later episodes to a variety of other topics, including being a little bit more focused on single living. So let's get started, okay? So as I said, I want to talk a little bit about health, and I think that lost in the media conversation with regard to COVID especially, people have been overlooking the value of good health. As I like to say, immune systems are the true heroes. As it's beginning to look more and more, we're going to have to live with this threat of the virus. We certainly can't seem to stop its it's the spread, especially here in the United States, as evidenced by recent events. Of course, there's going to be better treatments, thankfully, and that's going to help. But certainly having good health is a valuable way to combat it. Almost all the evidence suggests that people who are in poor health are most at risk. So I have a question that I often ask my students, I ask myself, I ask my friends, and that question is your health really number one? Is your health number one? Now, it's okay for you or anyone to make their health number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but I like to make the case for making health number one, not only for the obvious, which is longevity, but also for happiness. That when you feel good, when you're healthy, it's easier to be happy. It's just a more pleasurable way of existence. Moreover, it's just easier to be productive. That is, to get things done, to be more creative, to move through the world with more energy, to be invigorated. And thus, I see health as a kind of foundation for nearly everything else in the world that you want to do, certainly that I want to do. And so part 2 of Solo Thoughts will focus on well-being in that way. Okay, so let's start by talking about sleep specifically and rest and recovery more generally. So on Twitter recently, I ran a poll where I asked people, are you tired? Are you worn out? Or neither? And the breakdown was interesting. The breakdown was 30% of respondents said they were tired, 44% said they were worn out, and 26% said neither. Now, I mean, of course, I haven't defined what it means to be worn out, but I think that this is a big idea. And so let me tell you a little bit of a story while I cue this up. And we'll talk a little bit about sleep here, and we'll talk a little bit about how to overcome being worn out. So, as you know, as a listener, I had spent what I called my sabbatical for my sabbatical. I spent 2 months in the Joshua Tree Desert alone. And I didn't know exactly what to expect. I was fleeing the big city more than I was approaching the countryside. But I just knew that I was going to have more space and more freedom, and that it was going to be better out there than being locked in my box in the sky in my high-rise apartment building with all the amenities closed, and then my Los Angeles, what I call day life, having shut down my co-working space, coffee shops, gyms, etc. And so there was a lot to kind of get used to, certainly having to face the sort of potential monotony of the day-to-day out in the desert. But in hindsight, it ended up being a very good experience for me because I had not realized that I was worn out. So I'll often be tired. You're often tired, I suspect. You got a bad night's sleep. Maybe you've been traveling. But the remedy for being tired, so to speak, is pretty straightforward and simple, easy. You take a nap, you get a good night's sleep, and then you can kind of bounce back rather quickly. But when you're worn out, and this is what I realized that I was worn out. And this is not a surprise. I have a busy schedule. I like it. I actually don't even refer to it as busy. Typically, I've usually have, that was a minor mistake to use that word. I don't typically use it, but I keep a full day. But it's a day that is, in many ways, rather balanced. I work hard to get sleep. I get exercise. I eat well. But I also work long hours, I travel a lot, and so on. And I wouldn't trade that for much, to be honest. But one of the things that I noticed, having been in the desert for a while, well, first of all, my life in the desert, by virtue of being in the desert, ended up having a much more of a recovery focus than I had planned. So I had spent a lot of time, obviously, getting sleep. I didn't set an alarm for the entire 2 months. That's something that I can't recall having done in my adult life, frankly. I took some naps. I did a nighttime walk, out in this sort of Bureau of Land Management area nearby me, minimum 45 minutes, sometimes an hour and a half or 2 hours. I did some working out, although not incredibly intense, but a lot of calisthenics. I was doing push-ups every day and trying to find ways to be motivated to get a workout. As an aside, I was surprised by how social my exercise is. And when I lacked that socialness, even if it was just being part of a class or being around other people, that tended to suffer. Though there was a unintended consequence of this. I obviously ate well. I didn't drink at all when I was out there. And I just didn't have that much stress out, at least after I had launched my book. So for the first couple weeks were a little bit intense with regard to work, but it started to die down. And I really just noticed how much my body responded to having a bit more time to rest and recover and to walk and to sleep. That is that I just looked better when I looked at myself in the mirror. My body looked better. And so what I realized in hindsight was that I was worn out. And it's not a surprise because although I have kind of balance within my days, I don't have balance within my year. That is, I never take a vacation. I may travel. It's usually for work. I may add fun things on top of it, but I never really detach and I never really get to relax. Now, that's, I think, a big idea, the idea, and we'll talk in a moment about improving sleep, but I got fresh air. I had less electronics. I listened to music. I read a lot. I eventually got bored. Eventually it turned into Groundhog Day and I realized that I had to move on. But I invite you to question, are you tired, like those, 30% of people, or are you worn out? And if you're worn out, this may take, and you're like those 44% of people, this may take a lot more to try to bounce back from it. Now, I can imagine you saying, well, that must be nice. Pandemics don't come along often. And even if you're on quarantine, it's very difficult to do. But I want to press back and say that if your current lifestyle can't, for example, your work doesn't give you enough vacation to truly vacation, if your current situation doesn't allow you to bounce back from being worn out, maybe it's time to consider a different vocation or a different lifestyle and so on. I believe this is really life-changing for me, and it's a nice reminder that I might need to do this stuff a little bit more, especially given how hard I tend to work myself. So let's step back for a second and talk about sleep more generally. And, so for me, sleep has been, it's an interesting, I've kind of had two worlds of sleep. The first world was the first 35 years or so of my life. That is, I just slept great until around age, well, maybe let's say 33, 34. I'd fall asleep easily. I would sleep for 8 hours. I'd wake up refreshed and everything was good. And in those early 30s, I just started, and it coincided a lot with a lot of career uncertainty. I was job searching. Within academia, this is a fraught process. These are big stakes, very anxiety producing, highly evaluative. And, will you get a job? Will it be the job you want? You feel like you have kind of very little chance for error when it comes to this. And I was affected by that naturally as someone who plans, as someone who's an optimizer, as someone, very dedicated to his craft and his career. I just noticed myself, and my hunch is this was a mix of two things. One is my work situation, which sort of turned up the anxiety in a way that I hadn't seen before. And then the second one was, I think, just the nature of getting older. Insofar as I think that your sleep quality can suffer as you get older, is just part of the natural aging process. And so I never had a problem falling asleep. Thankfully, I don't have problems falling asleep. But sometimes I have problems staying asleep. That is, after 5 or 6 hours, I wake up and my mind starts working. And it starts working on problems. And because it's working on problems, I start to get a little bit aroused, not in a good way. And I have a hard time falling back asleep. And after 5 or 6 hours is not enough sleep to get up, And so as a result, sometimes it'll take me 8 hours to get 7 hours sleep. It'll take me 9 hours to get 8 hours sleep, and so on. And so regardless of whether you have falling asleep insomnia or you have this early awakening idea, let's talk about how to approach sleep. So it may go without saying, but I'll say it anyways, is I think that sleep is incredibly undervalued as a path to living a remarkable life. There's this sort of way that people, talk about sleep as this sort of very luxurious thing and this thing that you can kind of borrow against in order to be successful. This sleep when you're dead idea, which is, I think, a little bit ironic because I think getting poor sleep is a great way to speed along death. The most obvious one is driving while tired. But nonetheless, so there's these sort of two elements of sleep, though, that you want to think about optimizing if you can. One is the quantity of sleep, and all the research suggests that the average person doesn't get enough quantity. The magic number being 7, 8, or 9 hours, depending a little bit on individual differences. And then the other one is the quality of that sleep. That is, how restful is it? And so what are some of the things to talk about? So one thing, for example, is trying to get on a schedule, trying to build sleep as a good, healthy habit. This is easier for some people than others, depending on their travel schedule, depending on their lifestyle, and so on. But certainly being on a regular schedule, going to sleep around the same time every night, getting up around the same time every morning goes a long way in terms of helping both the quantity and the quality. In terms of quality, the other thing that I think the average person overlooks is what's often called sleep hygiene. That is, what is the nature of your sleeping situation like? And being thoughtful about that goes a long way. So I go to extreme measures, I'll admit. Some people think it's a little bit ridiculous, but in order for me to try to avoid waking up, I try to build a really great environment for me to be sleeping in. So for example, having a comfortable bed goes without saying, and yet I think a lot of people go cheap on mattresses, and I don't think for something you spend a third of your life on, you should try to save some money. So one example of this might be if you have a partner, if you're sharing a bed, a cheap mattress is affected by the person next to you rolling over or getting up and getting down, while as a more high quality mattress will limit the movement that you experience. Another is just, are your sheets comfortable? Do you have the right layers? And so on. Do you have the right temperature in the room? So sleeping, for me, I like to sleep at a very cool temperature. That's obviously easy in the bolder winters. It's harder to do in the summer, but getting a cool temperature in the room tends to be useful for people. Not always, but having that is helpful. Having a room that's dark as possible. And again, that can be hard to do. Sometimes if you're on the roads, being in a hotel room, I'm just often amazed by the number of lights that are in a hotel room, between clocks and TVs and fire detectors and fire alarms and so on. And so unplugging those things, blocking them and so on. And then I wear an eye mask. So you can find, there's several eye masks that are highly rated that you can find on Amazon. And I know at first it's a little bit weird to wear an eye mask, but once you get used to it, it's a great way to block out light. And so you've got the comfort of your bed, the right temperature, eliminating as much light, artificial or natural, as possible. And then the last thing, of course, is sound. And so having a quiet space, I will use a kind of white noise machine of sorts. I don't use my phone. I turn my phone off at night and I put it in another room in order to avoid that distraction and that temptation. I realize that's a luxury to have. Some people have to be reachable at night, but I use a plug-in-the-wall white noise machine for that. And again, these are all just ways to try to keep yourself not only on the schedule, but also just to have an optimal environment. In the same way that you might try to engineer your environment to be ideally productive when it comes to fitness or when it comes to work and so on. And then for some of you, I think that no matter what's going on with all of these things, you might still struggle with regard to sleep. Perhaps you have a medical condition. You might be overweight. You have sleep apnea and so on. So if sleep partners complain that you snore loudly and so on, I think this is one of those kinds of things where it is worthwhile to invest in the time and the money in speaking to a professional and figuring out, are there other things that you can do? One of the sad, really difficult things is someone might be overweight, they snore, they have sleep apnea, so they have very poor quality sleep. One of the things that people tend to do when they don't sleep well and they're low energy is they try to make up for it by eating more, by caloric intake, which of course, if you're overweight, then contributes to being more overweight, contributes to more sleep apnea, and it becomes this really, really terrible cycle. Okay, so those are my early thoughts about the importance of sleep, making that the number one priority, the foundation of health. As a quick aside, one of the things that I think has been really fascinating has been in professional athletics, the recognition of how important sleep is. And so professional athletes may sleep 9-10 hours a night. Within professional basketball, there's sort of this 2 or 3 o'clock hour where almost all of the players are napping, especially because they have games that often go late in the evening and so on. And so some of the major strides within athletic performance has been on this sort of rest and recovery element, that these folks don't have training problems. They get plenty of training. They have recovery challenges. And so, are you tired or are you worn out or are you both? May require different solutions as you move towards your remarkable life. Okay, so the next thing that I want to discuss is eating, is nutrition. I'll admit, this is a rather easy one for me. I think that my challenges with eating are fairly minor relative to the average person. And this is because, well, when I was young, I got into athletics. I wasn't a very good athlete, but I was dedicated, committed to getting better. And although, we didn't know as much about nutrition as we do today, I started to improve my eating as a 15-year-old. And one of the things that I did in terms of developing a relationship with food at that time was to view it as fuel. And so my first thought with regard to a meal is not to approach it as a pleasurable experience, but rather to approach it as a way to get enough calories to get through my morning, to get through my afternoon, and so on. So another thing is, and this might be just genetic, or it could be related to how I was sort of raised, but I've just never been very into sweets. Like it's easy for me to skip dessert. I've never really been to sweets. If anything, I like kind of more salty, savory, fatty types of foods. And the great irony and the benefit in that is that it used to be that fats were the bad guy and sugar was okay, and now that has certainly reversed. What makes me think that that's at least partially genetic is that my sister didn't have the same dedication towards athletics in her life, but both of us are kind of take it or leave it dessert people. And so perhaps. In any case, I recognize how fortunate I am, and please don't hate me for that. So I used to think that I ate well, and actually compared probably to the average, well, certainly compared to the average American, I was eating extraordinarily well. But I've made a few changes in the last couple years that have had a really tremendous effect on my health. It's really helped me transform my body, and particularly helped me get quite lean. And really, these are two things. So one is, this is something I started doing when I was much younger, but kind of had backslid a little bit, which is I do very little eating after 8 o'clock. Maybe 9 o'clock is the latest I'll do. And with that, essentially sets me up for about a 12-hour fast. That is that 12 hours of my day I will eat, and 12 hours of my day and night I won't. Now, I know that this idea of intermittent fasting is a really popular idea, and there's a lot of theories about how it's good. It's good for the human body in terms of recovery and metabolism and so on. I'm not sure about the veracity of those claims. I think it's really much too early to tell. But one thing that it certainly helps with is quantity. That is, when you're not eating calories. And so one of the real benefits is just cutting back a little bit on caloric intake. And I know people who do 16-hour fasts, 18-hour fasts, so they don't break their fast. They don't have quote-unquote breakfast. Sometimes till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They might just have a cup of black coffee in the morning and so on. I've never been someone who can do that. I find myself getting hungry much, much too early to do that. I like having a breakfast. I like having a good, healthy, balanced breakfast to start my day. As I probably have talked about, I do enjoy a delicious cappuccino to start my day and kick off my writing ritual, or at least my creative work rituals. The second thing that I've done, and this is consistent with E.C. Sinkowski's 800-gram challenge. She was an early guest on the Eating for a Remarkable Life episode. And very briefly, what her idea is, there's a lot of fad diets out there. There's a lot of very complicated things. She puts forth a very simple system by which to improve one's nutrition, and it's to eat 800 grams of fruits and vegetables within a day. All right, so that's about 6 cups of fruits and vegetables. And the idea behind it is that it helps both quantity and quality. So eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. The nice thing about those is it's a little more difficult for your body to digest. So they make you feel full for longer. So it just staves off the natural hunger that you tend to get. And so you're just less tempted. You're less compelled to eat. So that helps with the quality thing. And then obviously, fruits and vegetables are incredibly rich when it comes to macronutrients. So it's just good to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables that's there. Now, before I met EC, I had already started my own version of the 800-gram challenge. I didn't have a great name for it like that. And that is that I just started. I recognized that I was eating a little too much processed foods, especially sort of like breads and cold cuts, things like that. Sandwiches, sandwiches are great, right? Because they're easy to eat. They're fast. They're portable. They're transportable. Growing up, I was pretty poor, so they're actually fairly inexpensive as far as it goes into eating. So I used to eat a lot of sandwiches, a breakfast sandwich, a sandwich for dinner, a sandwich for lunch, and so on. And so what I started to do was replace sandwiches with salads. I will even I actually did it today, I'll often have a salad for breakfast. And I know people, and the salad may be accompanied or topped by a protein, chicken or steak or fish or like a poached egg or poached eggs. And people, they sort of furrow their brow at the idea of having a salad for breakfast. But I just remind you that why not, right? So what a great way to start the day with a very healthy meal that also really fills you up. You're not going to find yourself getting hungry mid-morning. And so I remember many years ago, I did something called the Salad Challenge. It was my attempt to eat a salad every day for a month. That sounds ridiculous, but at the time, I wasn't doing anything like that. And so I've really leaned into eating salads. I try to have 2 salads a day. I even track it in the same way that I track my sleep. To back up for a second, one of the really fascinating things about tracking your sleep is you start to figure out the things that tend to coincide with poor sleep, notably like having a drink, having maybe an early meeting or an early flight that might contribute to anxieties and so on. So I try to eat salads a day, and that's had this profound effect on my health. So I invite you to think about a very simple change where you're just swapping out something that's highly processed with vegetables and or fruit. And then the last thing is, and this has come up, I think, in the podcast, but I certainly want to reiterate it, and that is that it's harder to live a remarkable life doing a lot of drinking. At least one that I think is going to be viable in the long term, and especially as you get older. Drinking is kind of a young person sport. And so one thing about alcohol is it has zero nutritional value. So it's not good on the quality side of things, and it's really terrible on the quantity side of things. That is, alcohol is basically pure sugar. And no one seems to want to talk about that, but it's you're drinking liquid sugar. And so the way I've done this is I've changed my view of alcohol from it being regular and used in mundane circumstances, especially maybe to try to spice up a mundane situation. Because let's face it, alcohol is fun. The problem with alcohol is not how it makes you feel while you're drinking it. The problem is how it makes you feel all the other times that you're not drinking it, especially the next morning, and especially because it contributes to poor sleep quality. So move away from regular and mundane to rare and special. This idea of it's a rare thing, it's a special occasion thing, and you can, I think, sort of change the context by which you will have a drink. Indeed, though, this is hard to do because it is so socially sanctioned. It's such a regular part of social events and so on. The last thing about eating that I want to close with, I'll tell you a quick story. When I was out in the desert, I was taking my sabbatical. From my sabbatical, one of the things that I had to do, especially because I was sort of far away, was I had to cook my own meals. And frankly, I'm not a great cook. I'm certainly not a chef in any way. And on one hand, that was good because what I did was I made the hard decisions in the supermarket, and then I had to eat the good, healthy food that I had purchased. So there was very little temptation. It's not like sitting there with a menu night in and night out, whether it be takeout or at a restaurant. And then also cooking was enough work that I wouldn't eat just because I was sort of bored, because I had to dedicate the time to prep and clean up and so on. But one of the downsides of it was I found myself eating the same kind of meals over and over again. Again, healthful and not too caloric, but also just got a little bit monotonous. And one of the things that seems very clear about eating is this idea that diversity matters. That eating lots of different types of stuff, not just eating chicken all the time or steak all the time. You need some fish. And I'll give you an example of this, is that at some point I found myself kind of fixated on getting some kimchi. So if you're not familiar with kimchi, it accompanies a lot of Korean dishes, and it's like a fermented cabbage, which I know sounds really gross, but for someone like me who likes kind of savory types of food, it's quite appealing. Now, I wouldn't want to eat kimchi every single day, but I found myself kind of craving it in a sense. And in part because I was craving it is because of, I think, this notion of diversity that got into my head. And that is that kimchi is good for you, allegedly, because of like gut biomes and so on, because of the fermentation process. So I've been able to scratch that itch, but it's just a good reminder that deviating from what your normal food is to other types of fruits and vegetables and meats and so on is useful, especially from that kind of macronutrient standpoint. And it also kind of refreshes when you go back to your regulars that are there. All right. So the last thing that I want to discuss is this notion of movement or exercise. I like the term movement better than exercise because I think exercise has this view of going to a gym or running, something that you go, I exercise before I go to work, or I exercise after I go to work. But I think the idea of movement, I think, is more important. So I'm sure you've heard these stories about sitting is the new smoking and so on, about how damaging it is to just sit for long hours. This is something that I do a lot of as a writer, as a creative person. I'm sitting right now as I talk through this. And what seems to be the case, it's not the sitting per se, it's the uninterrupted sitting. That is, that most people who sit are just not getting enough movement. You can get away with doing a decent amount of sitting in a day as long as you're getting up often, as long as you're moving often. And from a kind of longevity standpoint, and from just a health and wellness standpoint, having movement / exercise in your life is incredibly important. So one of the ways that I tend to think about this has been very helpful. I picked this up from Nassim Taleb in one of his books, where he talks about, he uses this sort of barbell method, this barbell model for a variety of ideas. For example, he uses it with his investing. So he has lots and lots of money in cash or treasury bonds, super safe stuff, and then a bunch of money in highly risky sort of medical, technical kinds of innovation-focused companies, and almost nothing in between, right? Which might be like a growth value stock that sits there. And so while I don't necessarily do that with my own investing, I like this idea of a barbell approach when it comes to exercise. So, the average person might go for a jog. What a barbell approach would say is you want to intersperse walking with sprinting. So pushing yourself at completely peak capacity or taking a kind of leisurely stroll. And I think that sort of fits that kind of press hard and then recover. So you could think about the difference, which might be you do yoga and then some days you lift very, very heavy weights, just doing like 5 reps or 3 reps of incredibly heavy stuff versus what a lot of people might do is go to the gym and get on a machine and do 20 or 30 reps. And I invite you to think about doing that in part because these pushing yourself really hard, whether it be lifting heavy weights or doing sprints, obviously does tax the body. It helps really build strength. It really helps build muscle. And one of the things that's clear, especially as you start to get older, is the value of having muscle. So this came up in the bonus material for Charlie Merrill's episode, Pain, Injury, and Moving with Joy, is one nice thing about muscle, whether you're a man or a woman, is it certainly helps your body look better, but also it's really valuable in terms of protecting you from injury, especially as you get older. One of the really worst things that can happen to an elderly person is a fall that turns into a broken hip, and stronger people are less likely to do that. I know you're probably thinking to yourself, I'm 35 years old. I'm not worried about breaking a hip. The problem, of course, with strength is that you need to start building it now in order to be able to have it when you're 85. Speaking of that episode with Charlie Merrill, I think a really big idea is this idea of moving with joy. So as I said, a lot of people tend to think about exercise. They don't love it like I do. I love to exercise. I build it into my day. I use it as a treat. I use it as something to kind of look forward to. It's probably why it has that more social element for me. But really a game-changing idea for me was this idea that Charlie taught me, which is to move with joy. So all things equal, try to pick exercises, try to pick activities that you like, that bring you pleasure, that feel less like work. This is especially important, I think, when you're kind of low energy, when you're a little tired, when you're not really feeling like pushing yourself. And so one of the things that I often do in those situations is I get out a sheet of paper and I write down 10 exercises that I kind of like to do or that I kind of feel like doing that day. And maybe, oftentimes they may be sort of calisthenic based, but what I try to do is pick a diversity of movements that allow me to move my body in different types of ways. Now, I may not be breathing that hard. I may not be working to failure or anything as I work through those 10 movements, but I'm moving and I'm working muscles and working joints and I'm getting something done. And at the end of it, I often feel a lot more invigorated, a lot less low energy than if I had gone and sat on the couch. This is, I think, one of those counterintuitive things is when you're tired, move versus when you're tired, lay down. And so that really helps change one's relationship to exercise, that it doesn't have to be this onerous thing. Speaking of moving, one of the things that I did when I was in the desert was I started doing 100 push-ups a day. And so that ended up largely being a good experience. I was surprised at how my upper body responded to that. But one of the things that I noticed that I have since enacted is I've taken much more of a barbell approach to my push-ups, that doing 100 push-ups every single day, eventually I started to get worn out and started to break down a little bit, that I'm much better off doing 100 push-ups every other day or 100 push-ups every 3 days or let's say 150 push-ups every 3 days rather than every day. Again, push yourself harder and then take those breaks. And so the last thing that I want to talk about, and this is bringing this full circle and back to COVID, is one of the things that has been really fascinating is that there's some evidence, it's correlational, but there's some evidence about people who really suffer with the illness tend to be low in vitamin D. And so the natural kind of, and from a very medical standpoint, would be, you should start taking vitamin D supplements in order to do that. But I want to present to you a different idea, and this is a much bigger idea. And that idea is that you might need some more sun. And getting outside and getting a little bit of sun is useful on multiple fronts. One is, it is a perfect, great, ideal way to get vitamin D. And one of the things that's starting to emerge, and I'll put this in the exhibits. There was an article that I had read recently in Outside Magazine that talks about that vitamin D. Really, it's not vitamin D per se that has these health benefits, but vitamin D is an indicator of good health, that there are other things that are going on. And so taking vitamin D supplements are an imperfect way to improve your health. Now, there's a tension as a very pale guy who's had some skin cancer issues and every 6 months is in the dermatologist getting precancerous spots frozen off of him, which is, as you might imagine, really unpleasant, especially when it's on my face, is the sort of mixed relationship that I certainly have with the sun, which is I don't want to get too much sun. I don't want to get sun at all, really, in many ways, because of what it does to my skin. And yet getting a little bit of sun is super useful. And so I've been working at trying to get modest amounts of sun, especially in places that are less risky for me in terms of cancerous stuff. So like, still wearing sunblock or a hat for my head and neck, hands and arms, which get a lot of sun. And then maybe going for a swim in the pool or doing a little bit of a movement with joy outside workout. And so the other benefit of getting some sun is you got to be outside to get some sun. You got to be at the beach. You got to be on a hike. You got to be in a park, and so there really is something about having some time, spending some time in nature as an important way to benefit our health. That is that, sure, going to a gym is great because everything you need is there, but going outside and getting fresh air and getting some sun and being around plants and animals and walking in the sand without shoes on is an important, I think, sort of cheat code to living a bit more healthy. Okay, so I think that's plenty. I'm sure that's plenty for you to think about. Let me know if you like this. I'm going to be back in part 2 where I'm going to talk about well-being. Should I make some changes to how I do this? Please let me know. So last thing is that I want to say is that I recognize that I'm operating at a fairly high level. I've been very focused on my health and fitness for 35 years. It's a fundamental aspect of my personality, or my kind of identity, not personality. I identify as an athlete. And so if that's not you, that's okay. I would just say, you want to start small. You want to start slowly. And that is like, you don't want to go out tomorrow and start sprinting if you can't run a mile. You know what I mean? So I don't want to see people going out and getting hurt. But as I said, I think that improving your health is a foundational element to living a remarkable life. As I like to say, those announcements on a plane, the safety announcements, which is put on in a case of emergency, oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling, put it on yourself before helping others. I just think that having good health as a baseline is really the foundation for living a remarkable life. And with that, I'll say, really appreciate you listening. I hope this is helpful. I'm really having a great time working on this podcast. Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.